Today, we are talking about the 1950s. We're going to try and take an entire decade and shrink it down into, just a handful of minutes. Hopefully, we can stay less than 10. I'm going to go quickly through these. So, hopefully, we can give you just enough information to get you to understand the 50s a little bit better, but not overwhelm you with too much. First off, when we think the 1950s, we think television. This is really where television is introduced into American culture. Did exist previous to this, but not a whole lot of people had TVs in their houses. It's really going to be the 1950s post World War II where you're going to start to see it really take off. You had a lot of people working. Employment was at all time highs. So you had a lot of people who had plenty of money and were looking to spend it on things that could kind of show off a little bit. You saw much more programming in the 1950s come along where you were going to have certain shows that were going to become a part of the culture at the time. Um, Shows like Leave It to Beaver, The Mickey Mouse Club, Father Knows Best, I Love Lucy, all iconic shows that were really going to become a part of who we were as Americans. Uh, Keep that lots of people employed, lots of people had money in mind because it's going to come up later as well. All right, between 53 and 61, the president was going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower, aka Ike. He had just come off of being the primary general in charge of the American troops during World War II. Massive success there, and like many have at least tried before him, he's going to turn that military success into political success. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, also known as Ike. That's going to be a campaign button that's going to write itself. I like Ike. He's going to be the president, who is kind of connected to the 1950s. And if you think about things during the 1950s, they were kind of a lot of, hey, we're going to do things by the book. We're going to do things the right way. We're going to follow the rules, which makes a perfect sense if you look at who the leadership was. Eisenhower being a military general, it's going to lead to we're going to do things the right way. We're going to do things by the book. So society is going to kind of reflect that in the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Conference. Geneva Conference is going to be held in 1954. This is the actual meeting. The Geneva Convention is going to be this. It's going to be basically they get together after World War II is over and decide, hey, we had some pretty horrible atrocities that took place during World War II. We need to have a set of rules to make sure that these things don't happen again. Those set of rules is what's going to be known as the Geneva Convention. How do you treat civilians during who are caught in the middle of wartime? The conference is going to be the actual meeting itself, and it was going to be held in Geneva, obviously. The first McDonald's is opened in 1953. Now, let me back up a little bit. The McDonald brothers actually had restaurants earlier to this, as early as the 1937. But 1953 is where you're going to get the first McDonald's that is franchised as we know it today. Okay, the first one was going to be in this little building, kind of looks like a Ritter's, but hamburgers for 15 cents. Okay, and then they're going to kind of perfect what they do, and then they're going to have, and they're going to start franchising that. They're going to start, selling this idea to other people to do things the same way that they did, and that starts the fast food, that we know and love today. 22nd Amendment, 1951. 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution. It basically states that presidents can only serve 2 terms. So prior to 1951, it was perfectly legal for somebody to run more than twice, or at least serve more than twice 2 terms as president. In 1959, the last 2 states are going to be admitted to the Union: Alaska, January 3rd, and then Hawaii, August 21st. The hydrogen bomb. This is going to be something that is going to be kind of an extension of the atomic bombs. They're going to take what they've created with the atomic bombs and they are going to advance that technology further to what we know as the hydrogen bomb. 1951 was Castle Bravo for the United States. That was our version of the hydrogen bomb. Supposedly, 10 years later, the Russians came up with the Tsar bomb. Never actually seen anything that definitively proved that they created something that large and that destructive. But as you'll find out with the Cold War, there's going to be a lot of things that are very very secretive. That um, man, there's going to be a lot of misinformation out there. I'll say that. 1950, credit cards are going to begin being used. The very first credit card was going to be the Diners Club. It's exactly what you would think. 1950, the Diners Club was a card that could be used to purchase food, to purchase dinner at certain restaurants. There were only going to be a handful of restaurants that would actually accept it, but it would, just like we think of as a credit card today, it would be something where you could use that to pay for dinner and then you would pay it off later. I believe it was about 5 years later, you had the American Express card come about. Now, that was going to be a little bit different. It was going to be one where, today you can have a credit card where I can make a minimum payment each month. With the American Express card, still to this day, it's more of what they call a charge card, where you have to pay off what you spend every single month. So it's just a little bit different way of doing it. But the cards that we know today, obviously, the technology has advanced far beyond the paper cards that you see here. Disneyland was going to open in July of 1955 out in California. Drive-ins. Drive-ins became a big deal during the 1950s. Remember, I said that a lot of people had money to spend during the 1950s. This is an extension of that. It's where people would buy TVs in their houses because they had the money. Well, another thing they spent their money on was their cars. Cars became kind of an obsession. Cars became something that was a big deal for a person to have a really nice car. What's a better way to show that off than to take it and your family to a drive-in movie? You would go to these places, you would sit in your car, and you would watch a movie. A way to enjoy the car that you've spent so much money on and that you're so proud of, while enjoying some of that entertainment as well. NASA is created in 1958. So, us, exploring the heavens, the group that was in charge of going to the moon, things like that, the space shuttle missions started in 1958. And in the height of the Cold War and what was called the space race with the Soviet Union, we were all trying to outdo one another. NASA was going to be our way to win the space race. The links to tobacco causing cancer were first discovered in the 1950s. Okay, when I was researching this, there were a whole lot of really, really gruesome pictures that I could have showed you. I went with this, just the idea that, hey, there is a connection between tobacco and cancer. That was first discovered in the 1950s. Hula hoops and slinkies were the toys of the day. Here's the thing to get with the 1950s. Things didn't have to be overly fancy. They were looking for things that were simple, that everybody could enjoy, that everybody could do, that you didn't have to be wealthy. You could just have fun with it. So a lot of their toys were very, very simplistic. The hula hoop and the slinky are two examples of what was keeping children occupied during that time. Okay, their games again very very simple. You probably played a lot of these games: Candyland, Twister, Battleship. Okay, these are all games that again they don't have to be terribly expensive. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out how to play Candyland. It's pretty simple, and that's what was driving the imagination during the 1950s. Now, color TV. We mentioned TV at the beginning. We said that TV had been out, just wasn't very widespread. Well, as that was gaining in 1953, they actually came out with the color TV. Now, the color TV isn't actually going to become really popular with people until we get into the 1960s. And a big part of that is because of programming. Most of the programming that was being put on TV was shot in black and white. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to have a color TV if there wasn't programming in color. It's sort of like when HD TVs first came out. Not a lot of people were running out to gobble these up and buy them, A, because they're expensive, and B, there just wasn't a whole lot of programming that took advantage of the high definition signal. Now there is, and now they're pretty common. I just bought one not long ago for 200-300 bucks. They can be pretty reasonable. So the same thing is here. Color TV existed in the 1950s. It's just not going to become a big deal until the 1960s. The structure of DNA is first discovered in the 1950s as well. The building blocks of life are going to start to be mapped out in the 1950s. The phrase "In God We Trust" was added to money back in 1956. Prior to this, it was not on there. There's always been this big push for a separation of church and state. Well, again, in the 1950s, it was we're going to do the right thing. We're going to do it by the book. We're going to get back to basics. And this was a way to do that, to put "In God We Trust" on the money, kind of showed our Christian heritage. Rock and roll first is going to be experimented with in the 1950s. Three of the bigger acts that you're going to find: Buddy Holly. You've got obviously the one of the biggest ones is going to be Elvis Presley. You've got Chuck Berry. These were going to be people in acts that my parents, your grandparents probably would have loved. Your great grandparents absolutely would have hated it and thought it was an abomination. It was sacrilegious. It was, name whatever you want. This was what your great grandparents were absolutely going to hate, but your parents were going to grow to love. The polio vaccine was approved in 1955. A guy by the name of Jonas Salk comes up with a vaccine that will eradicate and eliminate polio. It's why we don't see a lot of polio around today, because of this vaccine. Before this, it was generally believed that if you followed precautions like this, you could avoid getting polio. Hey, don't mix with new groups of friends. Don't get overtired. Don't get chilled. It it sounds kind of silly for us to say, "Hey, don't get overtired or you'll get polio." But a lot of people were just gonna believe whatever was put in front of them. So the polio vaccine is going to come along in the 1950s. It's a big reason why we don't have polio in our world today. Nuclear power is going to become a big deal. We had the atomic bombs. Now, how can we use that power for good? We're going to transform that into electricity. Here's the reality of the situation. As long as it is done properly with the highest level of technology, with well-trained workers, nuclear energy is actually some of the cleanest and most efficient forms of energy there is. The problems come in when you don't have those things in place, when you don't have good technology, when you don't have highly trained and skilled workers overseeing it. Then it can become a big problem, as the Soviet Union found out with Chernobyl. The interstate highway system is a product of the 1950s. During World War II, General Eisenhower saw in places like Germany, they had the Autobahn. They had these wide open roads that would allow people to travel, in straighter routes at faster speeds, and it was very, very efficient. Prior to this, it was recognized that, hey, The United States, if we were to be attacked, let's say out on the West Coast, most of our military was in the East, and we didn't have a sufficient road system to get military equipment from East to West. So, as an extension of the New Deal, as a way to keep putting people back to work, Eisenhower proposed, hey, let's build this system of interstate highways. So before the 1950s, I 70, I 65, I 69, I 465 did not exist in Indianapolis. Thanks to Eisenhower in the 1950s, we now have what you know today. And trends of the 1950s. Just like you guys today, there were going to be certain trends that were going to go along with the time period. Certain clothes that were going to be worn by most people, if you were trendy, these were the types of things that you were wearing. These types of shoes, I believe they were called saddle shoes, very, very popular with girls. What are called poodle skirts were popular. It was a way that you could, take something that was fashionable and kind of put your own personality into it. So, adding these decorations to your poodle skirts, that was a way for you to kind of show off your personality a little bit. For guys, you had this kind of look. It was known as the greaser look. This is actually from a movie from the 1980s called The Outsiders, but it was 1950s life, so it kind of shows you, kind of the tight rolled up jeans, kind of the greasy hair. Cars were a big deal, like we said before, during that time period. Okay, this guy he has what's called a flat top. That's a haircut that would have been popular back then as well. Mickey Mouse Club, we already mentioned. 3D movies were going to be a big deal that was going to come out during that time period as well. What did teenagers do for fun? Well, next time you see your grandparents, ask them about stuffing phone booths or stuffing cars, trying to see how many people you could fit into some sort of small item. So when your grandparents say, "Oh man, why do you guys do that? That's so stupid," just ask them about this. This is something that they were doing during the 1950s, and I guess they felt like that was so. That is the 1950s, and as quickly as a presentation as I can put it, we'll get into civil rights in the 1960s tomorrow.